Greetings and welcome. We are in 303 and our objective now for the hour is to spend some small amount of time with John Donne's Meditation 17. You should be with me in your hymnal on 488, 489 and following. Let's make a couple of observations about Donne as writer of religious texts and then as political writer, because of they're somewhat symbiotic, and we'll want to make some points related to that. John Donne is a metaphysical poet / writer. If you've already watched my lecture on valediction forbidding mourning, I've made some observations about Donne as a metaphysical poet and what that means. Let's define it in its most simpleton language. Donne is very interested in working with concepts that are going to be derived from the most simple observations of real life. Okay? We'll have a classic example of it, for example, in Meditation 17, which, by the way, becomes one of the most famous of John Donne's little essays. Now, you can write this down. This is like what we would call a poetic essay. There are people who debate whether we're reading poetry or essay fiction or essay nonfiction. It's difficult, really, quite frankly, to define, to really split the hair. He's such a gifted poet that when he writes in prose, it's like he's writing poetry, prose poetry. Meditation 17 is going to be John Donne's reflection on the tolling of the bell. Now let's get a definition of what that means in our notes so that it makes some sense. If you've ever watched Monty Python's classic satiric little film, Search for the Holy Grail, then you know all about that one scene, bring out your dead, no, I don't want to go on the cart. Also, if you remember back to Geoffrey Chaucer in Canterbury Tales, we had the Pardoner's Tale, which told of a bell that rings if you have the cart being carried for the dead who have died in the plague. Now, let's get kind of some explanation here, what's going on. In John Donne's time, if you died, you were taken out of the town to be buried, and there would be some kind of a bell that would be rang or tolled, all right, that would tell people that someone had died. If we were in time of plague and large numbers of people have died, then maybe a number of people would be placed on a cart, a wagon, to be taken out to often mass graves. And the bell allowed people to know, stay away, stay away. Over time then, let's write it in our notes, the bell and the ringing of the bell becomes symbolic of death or the passing of human life. Okay? And Donne is going to, he's going to come to an observation where he will face his own mortality. He listens to a bell toll for somebody else dying, right? And he's going to use some important comparisons, and now at 2b, we want to make an observation of a word, conceit. Metaphysical conceit. Now, to say about someone, you are very conceited, means you're arrogant. That is not this word. A conceit here simply is going to be like a metaphor, all right? And you're going to get a sense of this one, that we're talking about the expression of an idea of the ways in which how everybody is connected in some way, all right? Of course, in the 20th century, to make a 3A observation real quick for your notes, Hemingway will use this phrase in a classic novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? Included some of the text, in fact, in the book. And in fact, it sparked so much interest that publishers actually rushed to reissue Meditation 17, right? The conceit that no man is an island was used to stir interest in a conflict, in this case, the Spanish Civil War, half a world away. Let's now go directly to the text. Notice that you will begin with a piece of Latin on page 488. Now, this bell tolling softly for another says to me, thou must die. And so we're now going to look at John Donne's Meditation 17. We'll have the professional reader read. All you're going to do now is just follow along, all right? So here we go. Meditation 17, John Donne. Let's pay attention. Just follow along, all right? And then we'll talk about it.
Johnson, farewell.
I'm sorry. Give me just a second to get set up here.
Love. by John Donne.
All right, here we go. Follow along.
Perchance he for whom this bell tolls may be so ill as that he knows not it tolls for him. And perchance I may think myself so much better than I am, as that they who are about me and see my state may have caused it to toll for me, and I know not that. The Church is Catholic, universal. So are all her actions. All that she does belongs to all. When she baptizes a child, that action concerns me, for that child is thereby connected to that head, which is my head too, and engrafted into that body whereof I am a member. And when she buries a man, that action concerns me. All mankind is of one author and is one volume. When one man dies, one chapter is not torn out of the book, but translated into a better language, and every chapter must be so translated. God employs several translators. Some pieces are translated by age, some by sickness, some by war, some by justice. But God's hand is in every translation, and his hand shall bind up all our scattered leaves again for that library, where every book shall lie open to one another. As therefore the bell that rings to a sermon calls not upon the preacher only, but upon the congregation to come, so this bell calls us all, but how much more me, who am brought so near the door by this sickness. There was a contention as far as a suit, in which both piety and dignity, religion and estimation were mingled. Which of the religious orders should ring to prayers first in the morning? And it was determined that they should ring first that rose earliest. If we understand aright the dignity of this bell that tolls for our evening prayer, we would be glad to make it ours by rising early, in that application, that it might be ours as well as his whose indeed it is. The bell doth toll for him that thinks it doth, and though it intermit again, yet from that minute that occasion wrought upon him, he is united to God. Who casts not up his eye to the sun when it rises? But who takes off his eye from a comet when that breaks out? Who bends not his ear to any bell which upon any occasion rings? But who can remove it from that bell which is passing a piece of himself out of this world? No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Neither can we call this a begging of misery or a borrowing of misery, as though we were not miserable enough ourselves, but must fetch in more from the next house, in taking upon us the misery of our neighbors. Truly it were an excusable covetousness if we did. For affliction is a treasure, and scarce any man hath enough of it. No man hath affliction enough that is not matured and ripened by it, and made fit for God by that affliction. If a man carry treasure in bullion or in a wedge of gold, and have none coined into current monies, his treasure will not defray him as he travels. Tribulation is treasure in the nature of it, but it is not current money in the use of it, except we get nearer and nearer our home, heaven, by it. Another man may be sick too, and sick to death, and this affliction may lie in his bowels, as gold in a mine, and be of no use to him. But this bell that tells me of his affliction digs out and applies that gold to me, if by this consideration of another's danger I take mine own into contemplation, and so secure myself by making my recourse to my God, who is our only security.
All right, let's take a look now at these lines and ask two questions. One, what is it specifically that is really going on with this ringing of the bell? And then specifically, two, what is metaphorically important for John Donne? I mean, he clearly is impressed by the fact that he hears a bell ringing and immediately starts to wonder, because he's sick, he's not feeling well. Is it somebody else who died and they're like ringing the bell because he died? Or is it some of my friends have decided I am soon to die myself, and so the bell has already started to ring for me? Let's go ahead now and kind of pay attention to the ways in which he works through and to this observation. No man is an island. We're somehow all a part. We're all connected in some way. Now, of course, there is a very Christian element to what it is that he will say, and yet there have been many, many who have read this and said that there's already a prediction of a certain kind of worldview that recognizes that somehow we're all connected as human beings on this planet, regardless of our religious affiliations or non-affiliations. Let's take a look. Notice, first of all, he begins by making the observation that because he lives in an England where there is a church that is a part of England, that everyone is a part of that church and therefore Catholic. Now, let's get this term out of the way. The word Catholic just simply means universal. That's all the word means. So when we're talking about the Catholic Church, we're talking about the church of everybody. Okay, and in Donne's day, everyone belongs to the same church. Notice he says that when the church buries a person, I'm reading with you now on 488. When the church buries a person, the action concerns me. All mankind is of one author and is one volume. And when one man dies, one chapter is not torn out of the book. Now, this is an interesting word picture. Again, we're talking this word conceit. This is an interesting word picture. It says the following. Your life is like a page out of a book. And your life's actions are all the words written on those pages. When you die, it's not like those pages then are just burned up, but rather he uses the verb translated into a better language. And then, of course, he lists all the different ways that people can die on page 489. Notice you can die by age. You can die by sickness. You can die by war. You can die by justice. What would be dying by justice? What would that mean? The political system, for example, has decided that you deserve death and therefore must die, you see. So, for example, yes, at the end of the play Macbeth, Macbeth must die at the hands of Macduff. That is a just death. That is to say, Macbeth earned his right to die that way. Notice all the scattered leaves again are brought together for the library where every book shall lie open to one another. It's a very interesting idea Longfellow will say in Psalm of Life, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time that ultimately might be found. In other words, your actions ultimately can be read by others after you're gone, after you die. Then he continues by saying, the bell tolls for him that thinks it doth. In other words, the bell starts to take some kind of symbolic value for Donne as he moves towards this really important passage that, of course, Hemingway will build his novel from. Let's go ahead and look at it now. I'm with you on page 489. Notice it. No man, this we would mean by man, human, right? No human is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the mainland, the main. Now let's put this in our own language. What has he just said? Somehow all of us live individual lives, but we're also somehow connected. Now let's go ahead and make a quick observation here. The debate, we should say, is of two kinds. Let's go ahead and outline both sides of the debate. One argument runs with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He says it this way: we live as we dream alone. We live as we dream alone. That is to say, the most important things that ever happen in our life, they happen to us alone. The most important decisions that we have to make, the most important experiences that we have, they happen to us all alone. And no matter how many people you have sitting next to you, when you draw your last breath, this view says, when you finally die, you're totally alone. That's one view. The other view is John Donne's view. And by the way, Conrad writing, of course, in the 20th century, will say, something in his Heart of Darkness in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when that novella starts to be read a lot. Obviously, a lot of people recognized we live as we dream alone is antithetical to this notion. And what is this notion? Well, it says the following. It says, no matter how much you think you're alone, you're never alone. I mean, think of it from its most simplistic language and understanding. Two people had to hook up and exchange fluids for you to even be conceived and be born. I mean, think about that. The point here is what? We have to admit that everything about our life is somehow social. It took two people to come together to produce you, and from the moment you were conceived, you were never alone. You were carried in utero for 9 months. You were not alone. From the moment you were born, there were people around you. To say that you are alone, to write the very language, we live as we dream, alone, requires a language that was taught to you by somebody else. Your entire existence is a product of a group. This is the sociological view, yes? And because that's the case, we're somehow, now let's get this word in our annotations, interrelated. We somehow are connected, even though we may not totally feel that way all the time. In other words, he says, each one of us might feel like an island, but we're not. We're all somehow a part of the larger continent, the larger land. And he says, if a clod, a piece of dirt, be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a man or of thy friends or of thine own were. In other words, it would be like saying that if a part of our country were to wash away, in the same way, one person's death diminishes somehow all of our lives. Why? Because we're somehow interconnected. Now, obviously, I'm going to have you write, if you've been assigned that topic, I'm going to have you write on, this idea. Do you buy it? Does it make sense to you? Let's keep going. He says, any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Now, of course, there's different ways to say this. One way to say this is the difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. Okay? Now that's a significant observation. Flies kind of, we assume, fly around until wham, they get jacked. What they don't know is what you know. Notice here, though, it's not a fly swatter. Here, it's a bell. A bell that rings when someone has died. Notice he finishes then by saying that affliction is actually a treasure. Pain and suffering can actually be a propedeutic of or related to the didactic, instructional. In other words, as the body starts to age, as we start to have illness, we can be reminded that death is coming. Not in a fearful way, but to appreciate the fact that our life is connected with everyone else's life because of mortality. Because of the fact that we don't live forever. You haven't met lately any 200-year-old people. That should inform you of something. There is such a thing as a fly swatter. There is this bell. Notice he will continue by saying it. Tribulation is treasure in the nature of it. The worst of times can remind us of what it is to live a life. And when we lose those we care about, we obviously are reminded. But Donne says, even those we don't know, we should participate in some way with their death. Now let's do a quick annotation of this passage to finish up. Let's begin by simply making some quick 2A observations in terms of major messages. Obviously, the message is clear here in regards to the notion of the interconnectivity of everyone. The fact that somehow at our high school, we're all connected in each other's lives, whether we know it or not. Let's think about the ways in which that happens in our own annotative work. Let's think about